You are watching Co-op for Two. This is a little bit of an unusual video for us. I've posted a quick before you buy it sort of mini review of Dune House Secrets. And I've played 3 live stream sessions of the game covering the entire campaign. Those sessions lasted between 3 and 5 hours each. Normally we would record for a game like this a long, detailed review and discussion between myself and Greg. But in this case, because I spent so much of the live stream sessions after discussing the game and discussing with one of the people in the chat, in the YouTube chat, who joined me for the game, I thought that instead of trying to have an additional rehashing of all of those discussion points, I would just excerpt from the 3 sessions, from the 3 live stream sessions, the discussion segments. So what follows now are the excerpts from those 3 sessions, totaling about 2.5 hours, and they are somewhat repetitive and rambling, so they won't be for everyone. But if you are interested in hearing a long take on Dune House Secrets, on the detective modern crime board game system, on the evolution, thoughts on where it went wrong, and detailed thoughts about what could be fixed, and specific parts of the 3 chapters that went wrong, you'll find it in the video that follows. And lastly, I'll just note that there's nothing new in this content of this video that you can't find at the end of those 3 live stream playthroughs. So if you're willing to sit through all of those, then you don't need to watch this. But here I've just clipped out the main discussions. So thanks. I would say enjoy, but it's hard to imagine anyone actually enjoying this conversation. But maybe it's a game you played and you feel like you need to talk about it with someone, then maybe this video will be of value. I don't think this game is quite for me. I mean, I enjoyed it, and I will no doubt keep playing through the other 2 chapters. There's 2 more chapters left. But I think fundamentally what we're dealing with here is that there are several sort of aspects of the system, of this detective modern crime board game system that Ignacy developed. And on one hand, there's the mystery and unfolding the mystery and solving it and trying to figure out and get ahead of the game and figure out who did it and why and what their motives were. Then there's a little bit of a gamey nature, which Detective Modern Crime board game had. It had this same kind of feel for different tokens that were used to activate, to perform certain actions. You had to have certain tokens. Now, Detective Modern Crime board game was much stingier with tokens. In this game, at least so far, we haven't really wanted to do stuff that we couldn't, although I will note we are now out of spice tokens except for these experience things. And I feel like this game, and in all fairness, it was not advertised as solving mysteries. It was advertised as an adventure game. And these gamey elements that are in it here, with the heavy, going back to the heavy use of tokens. It's interesting because Detective Season 1, which evolved from Detective, basically said no more tokens. And now with Dune, they've gone back to the gamey nature of tokens. And then they've added this little push your luck element, which at first I thought was really going to be painful, because when I first read the rules, it looked like it was saying you draw this token, and if you fail it, you don't get to do the thing. But now it seems like this could have been made clearer in the rules. But it seems that the consequence of drawing the wrong token out of this bag is simply that you move down on this track, which if you move too far down, you read some bad thing, but it causes you to lose you not gain as much experience, but you still get to read the card. So it's not nearly as punishing. But I still really question that mechanic, how useful it is. I mean, from a design perspective, it seems like you're basically relinquishing some predictability to how well you can tell your story. You could imagine if someone gets really bad luck, then their experience goes down to 0, and then they never power up, and so the next mission's harder, which means they find out less information, which means they run out of tokens. I mean, I just don't quite get why you would give up the ability to control the pace of the game design. That seems like a high cost to pay to add this danger factor, this push your luck. I mean, so it's trying to have us not turn over so many cards. It's trying to have us not take risks to find out more information. Again, now there's 2 ways that you are forbidden from gaining information that might help you. One is if you don't have the right tokens. 3 ways. One is if you don't have the right tokens. One is if you run out of time. And one is if you don't have the upgrades. I guess that would let you have enough tokens or time. Or if you're scared to turn over the card and look at the back because you don't want to lose your upgrades. To me, it feels, again, coming at it from someone who likes to play Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective and see all the clues. It's one of the main struggles with Detective that system went on a route that says players are only going to see half of the clues. That was the decision that the design made. That's Ignacio's decision, that you're only going to see half of the clues, or whatever percentage. And I question that from a design perspective. I mean, obviously these are the expert designers that are playing this game, but it just seems to me that I've talked about this at length. Better to have control of your story and make the mystery something interesting when the players see all the clues than rely on different groups seeing different subsets of the clues. To me, if you're only going to play it once, there's no real value in having different groups seeing different subsets of the clues. But okay, it would be nice to hear from the designers at some point about their different thinking on that. It does make some of the decisions weighty because you're saying, gosh, I really have to decide, should I look at this or look at that? And maybe that's the point. The point being that you want to make those decisions weighty. The only counterpoint to that seems to me a problem is that they're psychologically weighty. They're sort of self-induced, like watching a horror movie and making yourself scared. Because you look at those cards and you're saying, well, we could go and do this and spend a water and do this, or spend a subterfuge and do this. And I challenge you to logically reason out why you would choose one over the other. I don't think, in fairness, that you really can. So you're sort of agonizing because you know you only have enough time to do one of them, but you're sitting there trying to say, should you call heads or tails when you flip the coin? It's something that has an impact, could make a big difference, but you have no justification for choosing one way or the other. Okay, so that's all that. The fact that they've taken some of the mystery out and made leaned more on the game side tells you a little bit why this didn't satisfy me the way Vienna Connection did. Another part is just the setting. I mean, I'm not a super fan of Dune. I am a science fiction fan, but the detective solving mysteries and murders and dealing with present day or past day sort of non-science fiction-y crimes is much more compelling to me than this. The idea of being a detective trying to crack a case is much more of a compelling thematic experience than this, where we're given this whole backstory about being a smuggler or a prisoner and being rescued and owing a debt of water to this mysterious rebel leader who's now sent us in to do these miscellaneous things. It's hard for me to get myself in that mindset. It's not as compelling, and the motivation isn't there. That part is another reason why it doesn't quite resonate with me. I do think another part, though, is, and again, some people these detective games, more than any other genre in this tabletop world, I think, are very prone to some people having a fantastic experience and some people just not liking it, and given cases being hard to predict where you will fall on that. So this game may be perfect for you. And let me come back to the part about the end of the cases not asking you questions, because I do want to come back to that. But I want to stick with parts of the game that I found didn't quite work for me. I do think in some of these games, in fact, in most of these games, the best Sherlock Holmes cases and the best cases in Detective Modern Crime and in Gumshoe, there is a real enjoyment and aspect of the game that is about the challenge of managing an overload of information. And part of my struggle with this game was that, on one hand, it really was an overload of information, of names. These are names that are foreign to an American ear, but going to be foreign to most ears, set in a science fiction world of terms that are new. And just the sheer volume of stuff that's outside of a normal organizational structure of your brain trying to remember details. You're in a different context of concerns and motives that are foreign, and to have so many different names and relationships. And, it is a common, it's not uncommon when you deal with these worlds that are about political intrigue and houses, whether it's Game of Thrones or Dune. There's a lot of names. It's a lot of dense information about relationships. It's Paul, who's the son of Duke, and he's got a concubine and a wife. I mean, there are a lot of relationships and a lot to keep track of. And that's hard enough as it is. But then when you're playing a game that tells you, look, you're not really going to have to try to solve anything. It might be nice if you could try to solve it, but you're not going to be asked about it. It's not going to be so important if you figure things out. And you're going to get information on cards, on double sides of cards, and then some on these little cards. Some have information, some are just photos. You've got background information on these chapter sheets. You've got background information on stories on these cards. You've got these little pre-release chapter things. It's just a huge amount of dense sort of facts and names that's hard to keep track of and hard to get motivated to keep track of. And then videos that you have to watch and rewatch that are dense with information, and those interrogation reports, which you can't just read through, you've got to watch. It's the format of the information makes it a little painful to recycle through. And then there's the fact that I'm playing this live stream on a channel. And when we played Detective, as I said, we really studied some of those cards looking for clues. And that's one reason why you might have a better experience playing it with a group and not live on a channel. If you take your time, create an organizational chart, write down the names of each people, have multiple players playing, have one person taking notes, I think you might have a more satisfying experience, especially if you try to solve this and don't just write off trying to solve it just because the game is not requiring you to try to solve it. So let's come back to that, and I'll wrap up my thoughts there, and then maybe we'll talk for a bit on the channel. And I suppose we should talk about the experience stuff for a little bit, the different mechanic. So I do want to talk about this fact that you're not asked to solve, you're not asked to answer questions based on how well you understood the mystery. This Dune is like the final evolved state where it went from detective, where you were asked questions that you were judged on, like traditional Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective, and you could be wrong on, you got scored. And then Vienna Connection went halfway away from that, where you were asked questions. Some of them were wrong. Some of them you could be wrong about. Some of them you sort of wasted time on if you were doing something wrong. This game feels much more like you're just choosing what story epilogue you want to be told about based on what you're interested in. Now, I talked about in Vienna Connection how I thought that was a clever idea that I was not opposed to. I do think that these games absolutely have a path to take where they're less about getting answers right or wrong and much more about the psychological reward of wrapping up story and plot lines. Now, I will say this. The fact that we played that chapter with some real mysteries and some things we were trying to figure out, and then after 3 hours, 4 hours, we got to one question that asked us, what do we want more information? And sat there and said, I don't really care about these choices. I don't really feel like there's any of these choices are really information I'm dying to know. That to me feels like a real miss. I mean, that's almost like shooting yourself in the foot. You've created this mystery that's sort of compelling and has some compelling mysteries. And if you presented me this pitch of this game, you said, we're going to not ask them questions about how well they figured things out. And I'd be like, well, I'm a little skeptical. This game, people like to, you're challenging them with understanding this story and finding out who these people are. You're not going to question them about that. So they're not going to be motivated to try to get that right, or at least we're not going to tell them if they got any of that right. And then you'd say, well, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to let them pick which element of the story they're really curious to have wrapped up and learn more about. They'll pick one of those, and then we're going to answer those lingering questions that were really bugging them the whole game, that they'll be really itching to find out the answers to. They'd be like, all right, you got me. Do it. Let's try it that way. That could be satisfying. But that means, and one question, you're only giving them one question. That means, guys, that last question should be like, tell us the one really juicy mystery that you can't wait to have you get the final little piece of dopamine when you find out the little missing piece, that you found out all the other pieces, but there was this one little piece of the puzzle. And now because you did well finding all these other pieces, we're going to let you hear about that one missing piece. And the fact that we got to those questions and we're like, these two cartels that are the least interesting part of our mystery, right? Not about who's Adam. I assume we're going to learn a little bit more about that. And then we picked them and we got a little story that was pretty much what we already knew. And the one part that we didn't know is a little bit intriguing, right? It's saying that maybe someone else, she's not making all of her decisions. Maybe she's following another's bidding. So, I mean, there's a little bit of hint of breadcrumb, like maybe that'll develop. And if we hadn't picked this, we wouldn't know about that. But it seems to me that's a little bit of a... Seems to me that's a miss. This should be the psychological reward of what you figured out, giving you a little bit of information. Instead, it's more like giving you another little card that teases a piece of information. So if we picked one question, we get teased about one plot line. Pick another one, we teased about another. that's the same thing about giving different groups different clues. It doesn't seem, I don't get it. I don't get the purpose of that. So yeah, that's a good place to end. I do think the experience thing is interesting. It's whenever you're upgrading these characters playing over a campaign, that's quite compelling. But I do think it's the same thing we've been talking about. Should you choose to get an extra spice token, an extra water token, an extra fight token, there is no way to logically make that decision. You have no idea what clues you're going to see, what tokens you're going to need. So it feels a little bit of like an empty gesture, letting you choose which of those to go with when there's no basis for making that decision. And I really think we're going in the wrong direction in terms of giving people more elements, more decisions that are not based on anything that you can gin yourself up to feel like is important, but really isn't. And there were some other little weird things, like we got that history of Dune, the one video that gave us a backstory to Dune that happened in the middle of chapter 1. That was weird. That seems like that would be the first video you'd play. I don't know why there were no animated videos in the prologue. It was just pure text. That was a little weird. And then there are little bits of the rule book that could have been clearer. So I don't know. It didn't quite work for me. It's good enough that I want to keep reading. It does feel like a little bit of an interactive story rather than a mystery. And maybe you could play it like that without spending so much time trying to figure out what to do. You could play it by just using your gut telling you what clues to follow and not trying to think it out so much. But not painful. I love the system. I hope they keep making these games. I would love to, if you're listening, okay, I loved Vienna Connection. I liked Detective a lot. This game, Dune, is not quite working for me. I would love to see you go back a little bit to the detective stuff and maybe look at Gumshoe, look at the 1934 Sherlock Holmes inspired Gumshoe, and consider making a detective game that's back in the old time, back in the 30s or the 40s or maybe even the 1800s. But I would like to see more of the system. Jonathan says, I think the prologue introduced the game mechanics more than the world of Dune. I think someone who is not into Dune could not be brought on this journey. Well, I think you got a point. I think this game does not require any knowledge, but it sort of threw you into a world without really setting it up all that much. And it does feel like maybe the story could have been a little more of a gentler, gradual introduction to the world of Dune, like, you know, introduced you a little more to the characters and the lore, and that introduction about the history of the Atreides and Harkonnen. It's a little surprising that it wasn't a more gentle introduction to the lore as well as the mechanic. It just threw you down as a prisoner who had been escaped. Yeah, a little harsh introduction to the world of Dune and not quite clear where it fit in. I think you can make a strong case that there's a pacing problem here. That you just throw people straight into the most dense world with 4 different characters that players are playing with their own long backstories, and you're meeting 3 different people, right? You're rescued by this woman who has a right-hand man. Everyone you run into has a right-hand man in addition to themselves. They've all got their families. Like, these things have to be done gradually. You should start the player off in a very restricted environment. Let them get used to who they are, who they're working for, what their motivations are, before you start throwing them into 50 characters. And I've talked a little bit about Arkham LCG, and it's sort of like, if every game you're rescuing the world, you're setting yourself up for a difficult task as a game designer if every game has to be the weight of the world. And in this case, I feel like if you're setting yourself up a world where there's a different character and portrait you're going to see every 5 minutes, it's hard for people to become invested in that world. It's just a flood of names and faces and motives and stuff. And maybe picking a smaller, a smaller setting. And that's one of the things that Sherlock Holmes seems to do pretty well. Even though there's a big world, you're dealing with any given case with a fairly small set of motives and people. Jonathan says, I do not know where things would go after prologue. The first chapter was more of a mystery. It seemed to set up a ton of characters. I assumed they all mattered going forward. Yeah, well, it remains to be seen how much is mystery and how much is story based on mystery. I am curious a little bit to see what these main characters were, but it's hard to know. Like, you play a detective game and the guy gets killed and you're like, well, there's a much deeper story going on. But in this one, we found out that the guy was killed by that other cartel. Is it going to be a deeper reason, or was that the reason? Is it now? Once we found out some information and motive, was that it wrapped up? We've got this Atreides character, Adam Atreides, or goes under different names. It's not clear how long it's going to take that to resolve. There was some weird confusion, timeline issues in this chapter 1 and prologue 2. At least I had it when playing. I was confused a little bit about the timeline between Adam getting killed and the prisoners getting broken out and this mercenary. And hey, if the game was supposed to be designed so that we were confused whether the scarred person was the prisoner or not, then okay, that was achieved. Like, I spent some time confused as to whether the guy with the scar was a hired mercenary or whether he was the prisoner. But if that was supposed to be obvious, if that wasn't supposed to be something that tripped me up, if something's supposed to be obvious and it wasn't, then that's a bit of I consider that a failure. Make the things confusing and tricky that are supposed to be confusing and tricky. So I can't speak to that. Only the designers could speak to that. Still not sure what chapter 2 would be like. I agree. Here's the question. Is chapter 2 and 3 going to introduce new names and characters at the same rate that chapter 1 and the prologue did? If it does, and we keep access to all those cards, that's an overwhelming volume of different people and relationships. On the other hand, if chapter 2 sticks with these main characters in play and fleshes them out more and lets them refine them more, that would be a more manageable, satisfying thing, and then that would just be a complaint a little bit about a pacing. So we saw 18 cards in our prologue and chapter, and 12 we didn't see. So 18 out of 30 we saw, and another 12. That's, from a design perspective, that's fascinating. It's like a fascinating artistic decision. It seems super challenging from a design perspective. How do you make a case where the person can see, different groups will see, huge, a third of that they won't see, more than a third they won't see, and still make it a satisfying mystery for them to solve? I still admire that idea, and I think there's room for that to really work, especially if you're not dependent on people solving a mystery, but more for the psychological satisfaction. But I'm going to make, again, this is from the outside in, talking from a game design perspective. But look, here's what I would say. If you're going to make a game where the decisions are not based so much on logic, but based on psychological interest, right? Do the people, then the decisions shouldn't be framed as logical decisions. You should lean into that. For example, I'll just give you this example. you don't make the question, do you want to go in the warehouse or do you want to go to the tavern? If the decision can't be reasoned out and logic used to tell you what to do, don't present it that way. But you can still make the system work. And if you want people to go through different paths in the deck and see half the deck if they do one thing and half the deck if they do another thing, you can do that. And there's a wonderful, satisfying way to do that. But you make those branches based on moral decisions. Do you save Junis or do you save this person? And you can't do both. Now you've got a psychological weighty decision that you've given the players a choice to make, which will affect the story outcome. They save one person, then they get some outcome about how this person was saved and lives their life, and how this person died and got killed, and how their family is traumatized. Or maybe you decided, and Arkham LCG occasionally has a mission like this, where you're like, do you save the high school full of kids, or do you save your friend? Like, those should be the decisions. And the end questions, if you don't want them to be, do you solve this? Make the decisions. Do you want to arrest this person? Vienna Connection had one question that was like that too. But then you've got decisions that will stop the players in their tracks, make them agonize, but doesn't feel like the game is cheating you. And it makes sense that if you choose one path, then you see this half of the story, where the consequences of this person dying, some of the clues and encounters you read are going to be branches off the consequences of that choice. But if your choices are, do you want to have spaghetti or pizza for dinner? It's not going to be satisfying when choosing pizza ends up with this narrative opening up and eating spaghetti leads to this narrative because the person is not invested in that choice. And Jonathan says, I think all the Dune lore and terminology and names make processing processing someone reading the card aloud more difficult. And I guess the flavor that fans want. Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. It's harder for you to hear me reading all these names that are new to you, to me. And whether that's a critique of the game or just it's a different kind of game. Some people love that. They love getting deep into that lore of hearing like the Game of Thrones type thing where you're hearing about ages of families passed down, and some people love the richness of all those different names and keeping them in their head. And I've talked about how some people visualize, if they read a story, they visualize, if you read a scene description to them, it's aphasia. I believe it's aphasia, not agnosia, but aphasia is visualization ability, I believe. But if you don't have that visualization ability, then reading long pictorial descriptions of scenes goes right by you. And this may be a different category of things based on perhaps hippocampal memory, how well you're able to remember people's names. And perhaps if you're one of those people that every time you hear a name, you know exactly who that was and you remember, you've got a little locker that you put all the information about that person in, then maybe this kind of setting appeals to you more. And maybe if you're invested in the world of Dune, that will appeal to you more. For me, I found it a little hard to keep track of everyone's name and who maps to who. But you could tackle that a different way by building a nice chart and whiteboard and having someone take notes so that they know everyone who's mentioned, they've got written out nicely. And if this was a real mystery to be solved, I might be more compelled to keep notes like I did with Gumshoe, where I wrote down everyone's name and all the information about them. It's a little harder to get motivated to do that in Dune because Dune starts out telling you you're not really going to have to solve it. So it's a little hard to get motivated to do all the work. But if you are playing with a larger group, have someone take good notes on every person mentioned, what their relationships are. I think that would lead to a little better experience, and it's one of the costs for playing these live is that I don't put the time into that I might if I was playing this on a more relaxed schedule. It is hard to avoid comparing this to Vienna Connection. Think about that stack of 100 full-page files with Vienna Connection and 4 full cases, to this, which is a mini half case prologue and then 3 real cases. None of these full page sheets. I mean, I guess the money has to go to the licensing costs, but it's hard not to compare to Vienna Connection and feel like Vienna Connection was a richer experience. When you're dealing in economics or game theory or whatever, you often ask, what's the balance of costs and risks and benefits so that someone's indifferent to 2 options, right? You don't want one option to be, you sort of want the margin. You're interested in decisions on the margin. And it kind of feel like all the decisions in detective and these kinds of games are set up like that. Like everything is designed so that every decision is a flip of the coin. Should you look at this encounter or this encounter? They almost have to be designed so that there's no way you can reason out what you should do. But it makes it awfully hard to motivate spending time trying to think about what you should do. And the same thing with paying risks. You could imagine that if there were no consequences, or if you were sort of untethered by any kind of balance, you might make a thing where the person's like, do you want to like risk 5 tokens and to go look behind the wall, to look inside this safe? And the person risks all 5 tokens, and then they open the safe and it's like there's nothing there. Well, the game is not going to do that. So you know, if a game makes you pay 5 tokens or take huge risks, there's a very, very high, almost guaranteed chance that there's going to be some good information there, because people would be too unhappy if there weren't, and the game would be too unbalanced if there weren't, if you let everyone who went down that path. So in a sense, you kind of know that if you have to pay for something, it's going to be good. Now, very rarely a game bucks that trend. Gumshoe, the 1934 out of print, and maybe that's a clue to why it was out of print, the 1984 game set in the 1930s, was occasionally bold enough to be like, do you want to do this thing? It's going to waste 5 hours of your time. And you do it, and it's like you get hit over the head and you got nothing. But part of that's because it lets you replay. Jonathan says, I don't really think it feels like an RPG. No, it doesn't feel like an RPG. Maybe now that there are more characters, it will feel more like that. Yeah, I don't think it's feeling like an RPG. I mean, there's some issue with the characters, but you saw the game did not have us doing anything as these characters. Nothing in the game needed any of these skills, right? So Ari is described as skills trained in deception, can impersonate someone by mimicking their voice, facial expressions, and the use of disguise. And Daniel Arias has these skills, military expertise, including the use of weapons, explosive means of combat. Okay, so at least with the epilogue and prologue, that was just flavor text. It looks like it's something real. It looks like it's functional. It looks like the game is going to say, hey, if you've got military expertise, you can do this, like something like Legacy of Dragonhold had, a game I had different problems with. But not used at all, not once. And having these different characters with their different art and personality, totally irrelevant. You're always playing with all 4. You're always taking all 4 into battle. Whether they're on the advocate or the other side just governs whether you get a token or not. I would love to see, Ignacy Trzewiczek has been putting out more YouTube vlogs. More than one question. Yeah, that was a little weird too. It's like, we're not going to do this exciting, tense questionnaire where you're asked 5 questions. We're going to make the questions not have much weight, not be so important, and we're just going to ask you one. And yeah, that's a little weird. Like, not only do you not have a questionnaire, but you're making that finale part as thin and unsatisfying as possible. I don't quite get that. maybe if you really want to lean on that and you want to give up the excitement of having a final questionnaire, maybe you got to put a little more work into that final wrap up. Maybe some different animations based on what thing you pick, different psychological ramifications based on what you pick. Yeah, that's true. No puzzle fragments in this one. That's a good point. They got rid of that. I mean, I had my own problems with the puzzle fragments, but I love that they're experimenting. I do love that they're experimenting here with the XP and the XP mainly. I was saying something though. So Ignacio's been making these video vlogs on YouTube very frequently now, and he did a little video about Dune House Secrets, and I'd like to make a request: more video discussions from a game design perspective. Ignacio has written a book, and it's a more casual book about games that tell stories, but it's got a little bit of game design discussion in there. Like, if you're going to make those videos, this is a game where it's opaque from the outside what goes into designing these games. These detective games are very hard to design. They're intricate. How do you decide how many clues people should see? How do you decide which clues are optional that people, if they go down a track? How do you balance the time available, the tokens? Like, this is a rich area for discussing how you make such a game. And you've now got this detective system that you've used in several games. You've clearly learned a lot about what makes them work, when they don't. This is such a rich topic that would be interesting, fascinating to hear the discussions of the changes to the system, the different ways these different games do it, and how you balance such a game, how you play test a game, what you're trying to do. I mean, can you guys make some design videos about this system and answer some of these questions, why some of these decisions were made and how they get made? So I just felt the pacing of chapter 2 was a lot better, a lot cleaner. There weren't just a million things and a million names going on. And it was more enjoyable, sort of the idea that we were trying to find this guy to kill him. On the other hand, even less than chapter 1 in terms of deciding where to go. It felt like we just randomly stumbled upon what to do and were able to kill him in one way. It didn't really take any skill and didn't really advance the story. We got to kill Scorpion. He was built up a little bit as a real bad guy, but we had no real personal connection with him. The only we just saw him from afar. I mean, it wasn't that satisfying to kill him. It would have been nice in a game when you get to kill the bad guy, like you want to really come to hate him. And it would have been nice if we had some interaction with him first, if we expected to get some more satisfaction. It's a little jarring. Even if chapter 2 is more enjoyable, it seems to kind of go against the idea, like, you're selling this. If you came into this expecting to solve mystery, you're going to be disappointed, right? But there was some mystery in chapter 1. But now in chapter 2, like, after having been convinced, okay, this isn't a mystery solving game, this is a story that you're riding along with that's going to unlock as the story goes on. You're going to read more about the story. Well, chapter 2 had no real story, right? Chapter 2 was like all set in this one moment where we're trying to decide where to kill him, and we're just tracking his movements to decide where to kill him. So in that sense, it's almost like, if you had convinced me that the game was worth playing because it was a unfolding narrative story that I was getting to slowly unlock, chapter 2 is like a little interlude where the story doesn't progress. That's a little confusing. Jonathan, any final words? Could there have been animations of the assassinations? Well, another missed opportunity of this game. This gets right back to the thing about if you're not going to be asking questions at the end of the game that are going to make people feel satisfied that they figured it out, you should be giving a psychological reward to the players for their choices. And having an audio video animation of the assassination that you chose which way to kill him. I mean, that just seems obvious. It seems obvious that you would want to give the players a reward for their decision. And that reward could be a visualization of what they made come true. And part of that reward could be building up that character that you kill to be more of a satisfaction when you killed it. And part of it could be what Jonathan just said, a fun animation, a rewarding, satisfying animation of this person being assassinated. And instead to read like a little paragraph. Weird. And I don't know what the deal is with referring to him by his name, Akel. And that was not information we had gathered after our chapter 1. I wonder if some paths through chapter 1 would have given you his name, but why not just say find data on the prisoner? Why? That's just bizarre. Why are you giving us his name? Well, for what purpose? If you had said prisoner, we would know exactly who you're talking about. Just weird. I am looking forward to chapter 3, though. Jonathan says, like you said, pacing issues. Lots of characters introduced in chapter 1. Some come into 2, but it zooms in on 1 just for him to lead the story. Yeah, I agree. That's a little odd. Yeah, that's a little odd. And we didn't... Do you agree that the... Like, I need a little more personal motivation before we assassinated this guy. I mean, he was presented as sort of the guy with the thumb on this town, but he was also told to us very clearly as taking orders. And we just didn't see him be enough of a bad guy to get real satisfaction for killing him. Like, we needed to be shown that more. We needed to viscerally come to hate him. And I don't think we did. The person who got killed, this is like a storytelling class. The person who got killed, Adam Sorko, he was a bad guy. He's not someone we care about. He's from a cartel we don't care about, a family we don't care about that was ruling over this city poorly, was not a friend of the Atreides, and freed the prisoner to backstab him. So what? We don't care if he got killed. And this Scorpion guy who's on a mission to recover the weapons cache, like, we don't really care about that. We've got no personal investment in that. I would like more sense of personal interaction with all the characters. Yeah, that's another way to say it. I mean, we're taking these 4 characters, which by design are like bit players. The whole design of this game is like, here are these 4 bit players that got captured. They're not important to the story of Dune. They don't play a big role. They were captured and sort of pressured into helping out a little bit the Fremen. There's no involvement in them. They're not attached to anyone. No one cares about them. We don't really care about them. They're never in any risk. We're playing 4 of them, so we're not even, we're not even attached to one of them. They can never get harmed. They never... Seems like the prologue in chapter 1 built up Akel. Then he's just missing in chapter 2. Yeah, and not only that, but Jonathan, we know everything we need to know about Akel. He got sick working with weapons, and he knows the location of an Atreides weapons arsenal. And that's why the Harkonnen and Scorpio want him to find him so that they can get the location of the weapons cache. That is not exactly super compelling for us. Like we've got no personal interaction with him. All he is the location of the weapons. We're on a planet with a military industrial complex. All of Harkonnen planet, Getty Prime, is like a military production planet. And they're looking for weapons arsenal? And we really care deeply about that? That's not a good motivation for us. Yeah. And we're basically being blackmailed into helping these rebels out. But we have no personal investment in their fight. That's weird. The one thing, there's one little side mystery that's slightly intriguing is this guy Samit, who's part of Zazur's force that we're working with, and the intimation that he may be selling us out, a double agent. Jonathan says, Chapter 2 was more enjoyable than 1, but I think part of it was not being buried under the names. A big part of it. An absolutely big part of it was not feeling overwhelmed with so much information that I felt like we were not making connections. Whether that's true or not, it definitely felt like we weren't able to keep in our memory all the different players. And so it felt a little bit hard to read a piece of information and know where to put that. And with Chapter 2, with these cards and with so much fewer people mentioned, it just was a million times more manageable. It was also much easier for us to say, we don't need to go to these places. We had a lot of encounters that we didn't do that as a rare situation, we didn't find ourselves agonizing over the fact that we couldn't look at them. Like, this is one of the few times in all of the detective games where I felt like we don't need to see those cards. Like, they're not gonna change what we're gonna do. So it was a little disappointing that when we followed Junis, we didn't get more interesting information from her, more interesting options. I guess Chapter 3, we're going to meet with that Mentat or interact with them in some form. It's a little sad that those questions, like the questions at the end, I completely accept the idea that you're not going to quiz someone on having figured things out. That is, I can buy into that game design issue. But I thought the idea was going to be that you were going to let people make some choices based on stuff they learned that would give them a little more, flesh it out, reward it a little bit more. And the fact that we did learn some information about the Mentat, like, why aren't there questions that help us flesh some of that out, that reward us a little bit for having unraveled some of that or provide us a little more information? Timeline element. Oh, that's a good point. So Jonathan says the timeline element would have been cool if it mattered more. So, like, it really seemed to me at some point when we were looking at these cards that it was telling us very specifically, he goes here in the morning, then he goes here, then he goes here. And that was one of those things where when I saw it, I was like, oh, we've figured something out. I've figured out that the timeline matters. And then, as you point out, didn't matter at all. Had nothing to do with anything. That's bizarre. I'd love to see I said this at day one, I would love to see a long discussion by Ignacy and the rest of the designers, Reimer and Pazetsky and Spera, and hear them talk about some of these issues. Obviously, I get the feeling that in these games you start out with lots of ideas and then you boil them down to what's a manageable set of encounters and clues. And I would love to see that put together. Jonathan says, in Vienna Connection, you could really map stuff out on the calendar. Yeah, there were time elements in Vienna Connection. There were spatial stuff. There were lots of putting together pieces of information and ruling certain people out and saying this person was here at this time, so maybe they were this person. Yeah, I don't understand why that was in these cards but not used. And my comments on day one hold too. Like the idea that we've got 3 different ways to kill this person, that's the whole of chapter 2. The entirety of chapter 2 was this idea that you're going to decide which way to kill him. That makes no sense. Think about that. This gets back to the psychological thing again. If you want to make an interesting game that's not dependent on solving a mystery, but on the weighty psychological decisions, then have the player have to make a choice that has moral and psychological consequences. Maybe one way killing him means that an innocent doctor gets blamed and he's going to get executed. Another way killing him risks lots of other innocent people getting killed. Another way killing him costs you more personally, but doesn't risk any innocent lives. Then let the player struggle with the psychological and moral dilemma of choosing how to kill him. This was like, what area do you want to study for a way to kill him? And different groups will pick different things. I don't understand from a game design perspective why that's the path you choose. Procedurally, I still like this general system. And it's a little scattered. Like, I played Suspects, which I had some problems with the story and mystery, but was a little bit refined, sort of the boiled down version of this, where everything is on the cards. And it's always on one side of the card. It's a little bit of a hassle to have information scattered in so many different places on cards. Backs of cards, you have to remember which cards you're allowed to see the front and back of. You have to keep track of the time. It's a little tricky to do that. Suspects was a little bit boiled down. If you can get the mystery story right, it's nice to have unlimited amount of time. I do think the tokens and the time, our experience would not have been different if we had read all those cards. Like, we read those cards after we finished this mission. We read the ones we weren't allowed to choose. Those didn't add anything, and not seeing them made us feel a little bitter about not seeing them and about the choices. But it's not like they broke the game by making it too easy once we saw those other cards. So I think, for all the effort that goes into that time system, I'm not sure it's important for the experience of this game. That final question stuff was really just a real missed opportunity and very unsatisfying. Mechanically playing the game, though, is fun, and the system is good. And, I'm a fan of having maps and looking around. I wish they were used more, but it was kind of fun to have this map of the city. Gumshoe has those giant maps that also aren't very relevant, but it's always fun to have a map. I wish they had made more use of them. The 3 chapters did feel different. Actually, 2 and 3 didn't feel that different in mechanics. 1 felt just like throwing us in the deep end with all these names and places and hard to keep track of. And then 2 felt like this little interlude where you're killing this guy, which would have been fine if it was a minor part of a long campaign, right? Like if you had if you're playing Red Dead Redemption or whatever, you have this long 200-hour campaign and you had one little 1-hour side mission where you're just killing this guy, that would have felt interesting, especially if they had built up the motivation for killing him. But for it being a third of the game, this chapter 2 where there was no wrong answers, we were just like picking how we wanted to kill him. And then in chapter 3, we're told to find these people that you can't find, right? We read everything. You can't find them. Your goal is, what's your goal? Locate Martyr Attel. You can't. There's no locating him. You don't get to meet him. You don't get to talk to them. I'm curious what the other reviews will be. I saw someone posted one review on BGG forum, a written review. That matched very closely what we've said about it so far, I think. It will be interesting to hear what other reviews say. But I cannot imagine that people are going to be thrilled with that question system or the epilogues. I mean, they're two separate complaints. I mean, one is the questions at the end of each of these chapters were very disappointing and lackluster. And then this was a little trick question. Now, I can imagine if you got it right, you could, that's definitely one of those things, if you're a group, one of your group might say, whoa, don't say we know where it is with Samet there. So, yeah, so if you got that right, you might feel good enough about getting that right that you would have a little pleasant burst of dopamine from that ending. But all of the chapter endings, the questions were lackluster. I kept thinking, surely for the finale, I mean, this is another thing to do with pace and arc. You don't make a movie and then be like, oh, the third act is going to be like the most boring, the least is going to happen, and we'll just throw in a sort of one little question at the end. I mean, you've got to make a little effort, and the VP means nothing. Like, doesn't there have to be an effort for the last chapter to be a little bit of a ramping up of production? Like a little more work gets put into the last chapter to make it the last exciting finale? And to have a yes or no question, have it not care about any of the stuff we discovered, not care about our victory points, and then have such a negative ending? Another thing that's a little odd, another thing that was a little odd in terms of story, Jonathan says no animations in chapter 3. Yeah, that matches that whole thing about the final chapter should be the blockbuster finale scene. Like, this was the opposite of that. There was no animations. There was 2 files to be found. Weird. But another thing that's slightly odd is that, like, we ended at, we told where we thought they were going to escape. He actually escaped from the helicopter. I guess he got in through Sorko's estate and then through this secret and then went to the helicopter. But when we told her where we thought he was going to escape, Samet snuck out and had him killed. But Samet wasn't really, he was a double agent, but he was a double agent for the Mentat, who is still a friend of us, friend of the Atreides. He just didn't want the Fremen to get access to the weapons? That's odd. Doesn't that strike you as odd? Like, I thought it made sense. Oh, Samet is working for the Harkonnen / Mentat, and he's bad. So, well, I would have chosen to have him arrested or something. But then when we gave the good ending, when we didn't tell her how to escape, then Samet was tapping us on the shoulder and be like, we're friends. Yes, I double-crossed the Fremen, but... And now I'm going to go hang out with Thufir, but I'm not really a bad guy. I was just trying to kill this guy so that the weapons wouldn't fall into the wrong hands, and now maybe they will. So, not really a good ending. Our guy escaped, but now he knows where the arsenal is, and maybe that's going to fall into wrong hands. Like, we didn't save that information. He's escaped, he's somewhere. And Samit was double-crossing the Zarzura Fremen, but we just shook his hand and said, good luck. Yes, you were double-crossing us. Yes, you're trying to kill this guy I was trying to save, but you're actually the Atreides person? You're the actual person who's working for the Mentat who's trying to help House Atreides. That's a little weird. Like, are we on the Fremen side or the Atreides side? Sometimes you play a game and you think, wow, that was weird. It didn't work for me. But it was the vision of someone. Someone had a vision that they followed through on and polished it up, and things make sense according to a vision. Legacy of Dragonholt was that game for me that didn't really work for me. I didn't love the experience, but it felt like someone's real work of art vision. Nikki Valens in this case, and she's got a new game coming out that might fall into that same category. And in that game, there was a little bit of politics and social commentary and opinionated stuff from Nikki Valens. And I was very interested in seeing someone's vision followed through. And Vienna Connection and Detective felt like a real vision. Like it was its thing. It was very good at what it did. They may have had their flaws in different areas, and areas where it might not have accomplished its goals perfectly, but they felt like fully realized visions. You didn't sit and play Vienna Connection and be like, I needed another 200 documents. You know, that 100-page stack was its very satisfying thing. And this game makes Vienna Connection look even better in relative comparison. But to me, this feels like something got disconnected. Like, there were pieces of a vision here, but it needed another year of work. Like, maybe Ignacy needs to slow down with these detective spin-offs. I don't know how long it took them to do Vienna Connection, but it does strike me that Dune came out very rapidly after Vienna Connection, and I feel like more time was needed. And this idea of 3 boxes of this first box needed more work. I would have a very hard time having the faith to play another box of this. I mean, it was relatively quick. It wasn't painful to play, but if there was any sense that the other 2 boxes were developed with the same time and care, I would be very wary that it was going to be another thin experience. And I think they really need to pause and think about this final question epilogue thing and how they've implemented. I am on record as supporting this idea of making it so you're not quizzed on solving the mystery. I am completely open to that possibility. But you need to go back to the drawing board about what those final questions and epilogues really look like. Because I do not think it's working. And Jonathan makes another good point. Jonathan says, I still don't really think this would be good for someone who did not know anything about Dune, so not sure it would be good for fans of detective series. Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, you don't need to know Dune lore and care about that stuff to play this game. You don't need to know that information to understand what's going on. But given that the game does so little to make you care about the characters, the people, the factions, I think without that little juice of knowing this world and wanting to live in it and being excited about interacting with the Mentat, who are like the logical human computers, sort of less emotion smart, without sort of caring about Fremen, without hating the Harkonnen, without that extra little emotional sort of investment in these factions. I mean, we played this and had almost no emotional interaction with any part of this game. I really did not care about anyone. Didn't care about our characters. Didn't really care about this person we were trying to save that we only knew their name at the end and didn't know anything about them. Didn't hear from them. Didn't have any interaction with them or even hear about their history of any import. And then the mercenary we also didn't really care about and didn't have any real alliance to them. So we really didn't care about any of these people. And I think without that extra heavy weight, like the game did not gently introduce us to the lore. Like it gave us almost, first of all, we didn't hear about the sort of backstory of Dune until the middle of chapter 1. It didn't motivate, if you didn't know who the Bene Gesserit is, the one people in Dune that I have some interest in, like it really did not give you enough background to care about any of this. So I agree with you, Jonathan. I think this is going to be and that first chapter is going to be a rough haul for someone who doesn't know any Dune. Just because it's an overload of stuff, of raw factual information, of names, overload of names that you don't care about. Yeah, it needed to be more focused and needed a more gentle introduction. It's not just that it's not just that you don't have much investment if you don't know the lore of Dune, but it's kind of like this story was about two cartels that really don't have anything to do with core Dune lore. It was about how the Sorko family, the two cartels that are not relevant to Dune as far as I can remember. So it's like, even if you like Dune, why do you care about these bit players? Like, our involvement with the Fremen were just that we were working for Fremen, trying to catch this person who knows some arsenal that, again, we talked about. Like, why do we care about that? And why do we care about these cartels? The one family that we presumably care about, whether if we like Dune, is Atreides, and they're like bit players in this. Chapter 3, Jonathan says, was weird in pacing. They all felt like they were weird in pacing, but you're right. I mean, even within chapter 3, it kind of started off. I felt like when we started chapter 3, we were looking forward to finally helping these people, meeting them, resolving this. And it did feel like there was a little bit of a mystery where we were trying to track where are they going to escape, how are they going to escape, and then halfway through it just went off a cliff. We were just getting cards that were punishing for no reason. We had a bunch of things we wanted to do. We could only do a couple of them, and then the game was like, lose half your resources because you followed down this path that was costly in and of itself, and then the end result was you're stupid for getting to the helicopter base. And then guess what? The helicopter base was where he escaped. So how could we, if we had known that, we would have absolutely gone to the helicopter base to see if we couldn't secure it. That's this whole thing with this game. Like, And then here was the place we would have gotten the other victory point if we happened to go to the executions that we had no reason to go through, and we just happened to stumble upon hearing someone would get killed who's a bit player that we don't really care about, and then we happened to spend our time to warn them, we would have gotten a victory point. Like, there has to be some better basis for making decisions. I've argued for moral and psychological weight to decisions. This is just total randomness. And the upgrades turned out to be useless. We didn't need them. We could have used them more time, but like, we worried about having enough tokens. We never were in a situation where we needed tokens. The whole agonizing over what upgrades to take were pointless. We had plenty of tokens to do anything. We didn't need to spend any time worrying about the upgrades. We never used our special ability. Maybe we used it once. No, we never used it. We never used the special ability. So I'd love to see behind the curtain about the design of this game. I wish Ignacy would stop making the slew of videos where he's just talking about nothing, about clickbait, and give us a little look behind the scenes. Talk about the decisions, why they were made. I'm sure they will have answers to some of the things I've raised. No doubt there's some good reasons that we haven't thought of for some of these things, but yeah, talk a little bit about the design of the game and how. And you know, it's probably expecting too much to expect the designers. It's certainly expecting too much for anyone to watch these long rambling discussions. But the designers have stopped by in these live streams before, and who knows, it may be that at some point they get enough bad reviews for Dune that they sit down and say, we have to think about this a little more before the next 2 boxes. What can we do to improve it? And maybe at some point someone will think about some of these things. It's easier to read written reviews, so I'm hoping that we'll get some more written reviews of Dune that can say a little more concisely some of the things that Jonathan and I have experienced negatively about the game. Here's another thing that was a little weird about this game that I'm not complaining about at all, but these little pre-release hints were kind of fun. And the only thing I'd say, like these, we got at the beginning of each chapter, we got this little packet for each of the 4 people. They had some stuff, and they weren't like overly strong hints, but they were sort of like, maybe you want to consider, you know, looking at this a little bit. Those were fun, and the only thing I would say about that is that I don't get why those would be pre-release. It makes more sense. Most of the early order stuff is just like useless stuff like postcards and art and a larger map. I like that idea. And upgraded tokens. Okay, that's fine. But it's a little weird to give the pre-order people extra hints. A game like this, where you're trying to do a little mystery solving, should not punish you for observing things. And like, I really felt like it was an unfair play to be telling us, like, giving us on one hand hints that we should go to a place, and the other hand hints that we should know that we don't have to go to this place. It's so hard. In this game, it feels mostly random. There's no way to know whether you should go to a place, but it's especially galling when the game is like tempting you to try to use your smarts to figure out when you shouldn't go to a place. And I've talked about more with these detective games. These games rely on trust in the designer. As a player, you have to feel like trust that the game designer is not making mistakes, and that when you figure out something clever, it's real. and that you can use that information. And you have to sort of, a game designer in a game like this has to bring you along on their wavelength. You have to there's a little bit of calibration that happens in these games where you sort of, the game has to gently calibrate you to understand the unspoken rules of the mystery. And there's some unfairness going on, or some miscalibration, where the game is sort of encouraging you to use your smarts to not waste time, but then it's saying you can't really trust us to give you valid information about when to go to a place or not. And once that happens, you kind of throw up your hands. You say, well, I've got no reason to go here, but I've already learned from experience that that cannot be the determining factor. So you've already trained me not to trust you. Right? And here was a great example, the prison where we could have gotten a victory point. Like, you've already trained me not to trust that I can use logic to figure out where to go. And then once that happens and you lose that faith in the designer, then you're kind of just like, well, what does it matter? Right? Like, what does it matter what victory? What does it matter where I go? There's no way to predict what's going to be useful. There were a couple people that we talked to a couple times, but like when I occasionally play Sherlock Holmes or Chronicles of Crime, and you really feel like you're meeting characters with personalities. I really did not feel like that in this game. Even the main people we interacted most with, like Zarzur, Samet, some of these people, I never felt like they were real personalities. Maybe Junis a little bit, but then we didn't get to see her. That's another pace and arc thing. Like, you're writing a story like this or a movie, you want to kind of tie it up at the end with a nice bow, right? So we got, like I was saying, the one person I had sort of a little bit of an emotional interest in is Junis. Like, we met her, we saved her, she was talking like she's struggling with helping her brother. And how did that wrap up? We got to chapter 3, we were a little concerned about her. We thought maybe she was hiding them, maybe she had information. How did it wrap up with Junis? She was gone. She was mysteriously disappeared, chapter 3. Like, we followed her path a little bit. We didn't get to interact with her. She was just whisked away by the Bene Gesserit, off screen, out of the story, no resolution. We were just told, oh, she's tortured, she didn't give up any information. Don't worry about her. The one person you care about, don't worry about her. Maybe she'll come up in box 2. But yeah, we saved this guy. We didn't care about him. The one we didn't save him. We could have saved him if we had gone to the prison. We didn't care about him. There were no real surprise twists. We've talked about how we learned that the guy got his scar removed, but that wasn't relevant. He can't continue into box 2 and 3, I don't think, because one of the endings has him with his throat slit. This thing with drawing the consequence tokens, totally unnecessary. Adds nothing but luck and randomness to a game that does not need luck and randomness. There was no enjoyment in that process. And as I've argued before, the only real thing it helps with is make it harder for the designers to balance the game, because it's harder to predict how much experience people are going to have at the end of the mission. Just bizarre. Here's another comment about from game design that some people may not agree with, but this idea of bringing these 4 characters with you in your team and you're always bringing the 4. If you have 4 players, each of you take one of them. If not, you pick, like, to me, that does nothing. Having 4 characters just made us feel less personally invested in this game, and it served no role, no purpose to the game. They don't have interesting different abilities. it's fascinating to watch the evolution, because Detective Modern Crime board game had different characters you could play, and they had special abilities that were quite different. And I can imagine those were hard to balance for, but at least that gave you an interesting decision. One person would let you resolve hints that you do the dig deeper that you normally had to decide at the moment. These characters are not functionally different in any interesting way. There is a little mechanic here where, depending on the number of players, you play the game differently. That's bizarre too. So we played one single player, so we only were allowed to change 2 resources into a subterfuge. If there was 4 of us playing, then we'd start out with less tokens, but we'd have 4 opportunities to change 2 into each of the different things. Now think about that for a second. The only thing that convoluted mechanic of how many people are you playing with, what characters you're playing with, the only thing that does is make it that much harder to balance the game. It has no thematic value. You're always playing with those all 4. It has no functional role to how the different players at the table interact. You're always together making decisions of what to look at next, and together deciding what ability to use. It just makes it so that they have to balance the game for taking 2 of every token at the start is the same difficulty as taking 1 and being able to switch them. And there's no thematic reason why, when you take a character to play, you have this ability, and if you take it as a advocate, you get an extra token. It's the same thing as with this bag, and it adds nothing to the game, but make it more chaotic, more random, make it so that a group could have bad luck. Jonathan's pointing out another positive. I do appreciate that you're pointing out positives. That's a good idea for us to think about what's new in this game that's a positive. Jonathan's pointing out one of them, that the prologue introduced you to the system. Needs to be a better introduction to Dune, though. I think you're right. I think that's a good addition to the system. Make a short, gentle prologue case that doesn't, especially if it's a campaign where there are consequences. The idea of having an initial prologue that introduces you to the system and the lore and the way it works and the mechanics before you dive them in is a very good idea. It failed to introduce people to Dune properly, which was a real missed opportunity, but it is a good idea. It's also a good idea in another sense. If you were interested in Vienna Connection or Detective, you could watch a playthrough of the prologue, and I think it makes sense for all of these games, and some of them has it. Suspects has a little introductory case. I think those cases should be designed as sort of ones where spoiling that intro case would not detract from the game. In this case, they didn't do that because the prologue sets up the main story that you're playing. But I think if we roll with Jonathan's suggestion and just embrace that idea, make a prologue that doesn't spoil anything in the campaign, that is, it can even be shorter than this prologue was, that's sort of a throwaway little experience but gives you the flavor of what the game is like. Then it would also have the benefit of letting people not worry about being spoiled. They could watch a playthrough, they could watch it demonstrated during a review, and you could use that for all of them. Here's another positive. Jonathan says, like the solve crime, then switch to performing a crime. Yeah, I think that's fair enough. It was exciting. It was fun to unveil chapter 2 and be told, now you're going to go plot the execution of this guy. And if that had been more satisfying, if the nature of that mission hadn't been that, like, no matter what you do, you're going to win it, if we had had to try to figure out how to kill this person in an interesting way, or if we had gotten rewarded by some fun animation of how we killed him, then it would be like the game Hitman, where you're trying to figure out the pieces of a mousetrap to get this person killed, and then you could watch it unfold, and it was satisfying. And if we had a little more motivation to get revenge on this guy, that would have been a very fun little interlude. So I agree with you there that you could see that idea matched in another game, like a detective game. And again, getting back to our discussions of pacing, wouldn't that have made for a good finale, Jonathan? Like if chapter 1 and 2 were building on this hunt and detective and making us more emotionally involved in hating this really bad guy, if the last finale act was like, now you can get your revenge, that might have been exciting. Jonathan says, here's another positive. I like the idea in chapter 2 of learning more about a character by observing them. Remind me what we did in chapter 2 that was about observing people? Oh, you mean when we were observing Scorpion and following him around and learning about his habits so we could attack him. Yes, you're absolutely right. That sort of combined two things. It was being able to do the detective work of following him around and figuring out where he would go, at least the promise of that, and then being able to use that information to accomplish a goal. And Jonathan, interesting to focus on one person. I think you're absolutely right, and I think that almost deserves its own mention here. Part of what failed in this game is, starting in chapter 1, we were just thrown a million people that we didn't care about, that we could never get enough information on any of them to care about or be invested in or feel there was a personality. And the one place where we were sort of got a chance to focus in more like a laser on one person and wrap our heads around it was when we were focusing in on that one person. And how satisfying would that have been if we cared about them and we could really get revenge on them? But in the end, it was like, it doesn't matter if you kill this guy. First of all, he's not that bad, and he's just going to get replaced, so you don't really care. But you are right. Like, this is another lesson, and I wish there are games that I've talked about, Arkham LCG, trying to scope out you're saving the world, and you sort of don't care about individuals when that happens. Like, you don't need to make a game about saving the galaxy where people are ants that you don't care about. Like, it worked better when we were focused on one person and their habits and studying them and resolving interactions and consequences of their life and what they were doing. That worked better than when we had all these people that we didn't care about that were playing these minor roles that barely had any interaction with ours. I did like the use of maps. It's not that I liked the use of maps, because we didn't have much use of the maps. I would have liked if the maps were more important to figure out spatial arrangements. But I liked that there were more maps. We had no use of this map, right? Everything was in one place. That's weird. That's bizarre, but you could imagine that further boxes could use the same map. Look at this, all these inset detailed map, all unimportant, not relevant at all. Not only not relevant, like the map in Gumshoe, this big giant map of San Francisco, was largely irrelevant, but at least you traveled around on it and you could say, oh, isn't it cool, we're over here now. Like this game, you never went anywhere on this map, so this one big map, but it looks nice. It's a little bit of thematic stuff. This map we did move around in, but we didn't really care. Nothing was important for us. There was no spatial arrangement that was important. But I would like to see more of that. And I've already argued against the upgrade system because I think functionally it doesn't add anything. And it would seem like it would only make the game design process harder. But unlike the consequence track, the decisions of how to upgrade were, making any decision of how to upgrade your character in a game, in a campaign, is always feels weighty and important and agonizing. And, that was there in this game. It was just a letdown, but it was potential. And if you could make that work and make that interesting, then that could have been interesting. And it could have been fun to pick a way to play the game by picking a certain path of upgrades that would make you play the game differently, that would lead to different outcomes. It didn't in our case. We just had an abundance of tokens, and so I'd like to see that worked on a little more. If you could make it so that your upgrades have story consequences, predictable story consequences, that made you feel like, well, that was the route I picked. I chose to go down a stealthy route, and so those were the options that were become available to me. Here was the skill I developed, so I was able to do these certain ways of accomplishing goals, and I had to find different ways than if I had gone and built up my strength. In this game, that's not the case. They were useless, and they turned out to be pointless. Here's another positive. Jonathan says, I think they tried to make everyone matter. You met a customs agent in Chapter 1. You would not think he would come into Chapter 3, but he did. Not executed perfectly, though. Yeah, I mean, we did get thrown everyone in Chapter 1 in the prologue, and then we did stay in Tel Gezer for Chapter 3, so we did encounter these people again. I mean, maybe that's a positive. It is a positive that we encounter the same people. They weren't fleshed out to me, so I didn't feel invested in them. I've already talked a little bit about these asset cards, and I've suggested what I think would be a real improvement to them, which is make these quote-unquote asset cards, which are sort of free, you don't have to spend time to get them, and they're basically just illustrations, but mostly of people and portraits. So make them full-size index cards that have the photo, the person's name, maybe some basic information that you learned about them, and then a place to write notes. Then you wouldn't get so drowned in a flood of names, because you'd be able to look at that and know the name, and it would help you keep notes, and you could have a place for adding notes on that card. And maybe you could do something additional with that card. Maybe like Suspects has a way you can line up people to match their fingerprints and stuff like that. I think there are possibilities to evolve this system of assets that were missed, but would be a good direction to go. Jonathan says, here's another positive. Switching to the victory points in the final act was fun until they didn't matter. Yeah. They've tried, in fairness, in Vienna Connection, in Detective, and in this, they've clearly walked into it saying the final chapter should feel different. And they've done that in all three cases by changing the little track thing at the end for the end case. I forget exactly how it changed in Vienna Connection and Detective, but in Detective you flip it over and you've got everything's happening on one day or something. And so they have made an attempt in each of these games to make the final act feel mechanically a little different. Here they did this thing, but that was bizarre how it didn't care. It didn't care what your victory points were. There was only one way to get up to the 9. If you got all of them right, you would have gotten up to the 9 and paid no cost. But we really went into it blind. It's another case of like, not only was this mechanic not followed through in the end to make it mean anything, but the game gave you no information of how many points you could be expected to find, how much it would be negative, how much it would be likely that you would drop down. So like, we had no way of judging what was important. We had no way of knowing when we found 2 victory points. Was that a big deal, a small deal? Were we going to find a lot more of them? Should we risk one of them? Like, the game gave us no guidance to that. and which again just makes it feel random. I mean, this was another new thing, these maps. Here's another example of sort of a wasted, like, look at these cool cards we got in Chapter 2. There were a lot of them. Chapter 2, you're like, figure out, decide where to assassinate this guy. And we got all these map cards that we could look at if we wanted to. We had to pay time or cost to look at them. They've got these diagrams that look like they're helping you see how this guy got to the scene or where we would attack him, where we would plan an attack. And that seemed like that was a cool mechanic. Like, can we figure out where we can catch him? Like, if you were playing Hitman, you'd be like, when you play this game Hitman, which I recommend, there's like 5 or 6 iterations of this game. You've got some target you're trying to assassinate. You could kill them in lots of different ways. You can poison them, shoot them, push them over a ledge, etc. Sabotage electricity in their bathroom, whatever. But a big part of this game is you're stealthily walking around, observing this person's pattern of behavior. They're frequently surrounded by other people, and you're frequently trying to figure out, how am I going to get them alone so I can kill them and not be noticed? So like, you look at these and you're like, wow, is that what we're going to do in this mission? Or are we going to have to follow him around and figure out the one time he's alone and the one way we can get into his thing? And is this diagram going to help us figure out where we can ambush him? And the answer is no. Those diagrams are totally irrelevant, not functionally valuable to you at all. And in fact, you don't have to figure out where to kill him. You can kill him anywhere. There is no wrong answer. The game isn't even going to attempt to make it a puzzle you have to solve. It's just sort of, you're going to read, and depending on what path you go down, you're going to get the resources to kill him in one place or another. There'll be no real way for you to, even if you wanted to kill him in one place, you're just shooting around in the dark till you get the resources to kill him in a specific place. And then the game just asks you, which place have you chosen? There's no wrong answer. You pick one. As long as you pick the one that you got the resources for, and it gives you one sentence that says how he got killed. And then it tells you explicitly, killing him doesn't matter. He's just replaced. Jonathan says, I think if you understood what the tokens would be useful for in a mission, would make choosing which ones you want through the XP system more meaningful. Okay, well, you're touching on a point that is absolutely true, and it was true for Detective, and it is a flaw in the system. You could see where they were going for, but it's not one that's easy to fix. And the point is this. You've got these different tokens. In this case, 4 different tokens. Weapons, subterfuge, spice, and water, and a wild card. Detective Modern Crime board game had less tokens, but a variety as well. Now, in Detective, we frequently got to a point where we were really short on tokens, and occasionally there'd be a clue you couldn't look at because you had no way to get this token. In this game, I felt like we were flooded with tokens, but mainly because we took some of them as the upgrades. But here's the flaw in the system, and it's hard to fix. But the problem is, there is no way to know which tokens you're going to need. Absolutely no way. In fact, not only can you not know which tokens in a given chapter or game you're going to need, how many, like, they vary widely. We had chapter 3 wanted weapons. We spent the whole first 2 chapters and prologue never encountering something that wanted weapons tokens. So not only is the game totally blind to you, opaque, random in terms of what tokens you might need before playing a game. So it makes it impossible to know what you should be trying to conserve, what you should try to get, and puts you in a position of just saying, I need equal amounts of everything, because it's not like I'm given a choice on a card. You can either tackle it this way by spending water or tackle it this way by doing spice. That's not how it works. You just pick up a card and it says, hey, if you have spice, you can look at this new thing. If you don't, you can't. So not only is it completely unpredictable, which leaves you just not caring in a game length, but it's completely unpredictable even within a card. even within a card of saying, I'm going to choose to look at this card, you have no idea what token might be on the back of that card. So you can't even make a micro level strategic decision of saying, well, I've got water, so let me spend my time here and let me be smart about going here because this is likely to need water and I don't have water, so let me use my brains to not go there. You can't even do it on a turn-by-turn, encounter-by-encounter basis, which means it's basically meaningless. And then to punish, then in this game, whereas Detective was tight on tokens, here there's so many abundance of tokens that you feel like you're being punished for caring about tokens. Like, oh, you're a sucker for loading up on tokens because guess what? In this game, you're going to always have plenty. You should have taken the other upgrades. Okay, Jonathan says, positive, figuring out there was a double agent was fun. I agree. Sort of Summit was the only one that there was enough foreshadowing about. There were a couple things that were a little bit foreshadowed. Like Summit was foreshadowed. Although, like I said, I've got a little bit of a bitter taste in my mouth about Summit not being a bad guy. So, like, you could argue that helping him kill this guy was a good thing. So he wasn't really a real bad guy. But it was nice to see some foreshadow. Like, right in the beginning, he dropped us off and he's like, I gotta go. But then we saw him skulking about. So, like, we saw some little hints of him. That was nice foreshadowing. And there were a couple of things that felt like the game invested enough in. Like, there was someone behind the scenes pulling strings, and then someone arrived and we didn't know who it was. And then we figured out it was Thufir Hawat. So there were a couple things like that that were dosed out at a pace that felt a little bit satisfying. There were a couple of weird things, like I found it very odd in chapter 2 that it's like, find Akel, and you're like, who's Akel? And then later in the chapter you learn, oh, that is the real name of the person you're trying to find. Like, that's like a mistake. If we could get to this point, and if we're most likely to get to this point, having not yet learned the name of this key figure that we're trying to find the name of, very weird that seems like you accidentally gave us the name. It wasn't that important that we know his name or not, but it jumped out as weird. There's another game that happened. It might have been one of the Detective or Vienna Connection, where it's like, it assumed we had solved something before we had solved it. I was like, gee, thanks. I would have liked a chance to solve that mystery, and now you've told me as a wrap-up, as a prelude, the answer. Here's a positive. I do feel like there were less important things that we didn't have time to do. I feel like in Detective, there were a bunch of leads that would have helped, that would have been nice to be able to look at. And I felt a little bit ripped off by the system that it didn't give us enough time to look at them. Here, I felt like it was a little more generous in terms of, time was still tight, but it was a little more generous in terms of giving us enough cards that we heard the whole story, which I think is the right decision. In fact, I think Suspects is the better decision, which is ultimately let the people see all the cards. You can penalize them in score, in psychological reward and score, but let them see all the cards. Don't hide pieces of the mystery for them. And then have a different mechanic for rewarding them for figuring things out early. I talk a lot about psychological and moral weight. Well, here's an idea. Let players see every card. In other words, don't cap them on time, but have a cost to be paid for looking at cards, maybe a moral cost. You could imagine, what if we did something that ended up hurting one of our friends or putting the Fremen in a worse position, or as time passed, more people got killed, maybe people we cared about. Then you'd have a tough moral decision there. You'd be like, well, is it so important to resolve this mystery? Am I willing to take a worse score, or am I willing to hear a worse story ending about what happened to the city or the civilians? And I think that would be a more agonizing, interesting, satisfying choice than just not being able to see cards. Positive compared to Modern Detective, the card text felt tight. I think I might agree with you there. And concise and relevant. I think that's true. I think Detective had many more cards that were not advancing a story, but were just flavor text to fill space. Whereas here, they were all advancing a narrative, a story. Sometimes it was a side story that you didn't care about too much, but it didn't feel like it was just filling space. It was telling some sort of story that put you in this world. Positive, the planning focus in chapter 2 might be better for large group than mystery. I don't know. I think chapter 2 had such an intriguing possibility for a fun experience, but I really soured on it when it became clear we couldn't do anything wrong. That no matter how we tackled chapter 2, we didn't have to think about a single thing. We could just turn over cards. They wanted to kill him with the poison. That was done deal. There was nothing more once we got there. And I thought when we started seeing those cards that were like, first he goes here in the morning, then he shows up here at this time, and then the next card was like, and then he goes here. I was like, oh, this is going to be a timeline thing. We're going to get questioned in the end like, it's 4 o'clock, where do you kill him? And we have to have pieced together the timeline to figure out where. The fact that none of that was important really soured me on that experience. If we were giving them advice for the next 2 boxes, I think what we would say is maybe go back to school on writing a compelling story. I mean, if we were to make dramatic change, I'd say drop the 4 characters, have the players always controlling one character, sort of emotionally involved in the story. Smaller in scope in terms of the number of the people you interact with. Work more on the arc so you care more about the lives of the people you're saving or who are going to get harmed. If you're going to get revenge on someone, make it that you care about getting revenge on them. The Harkonnen in the movie and in the book are not these anonymous people off screen. You see them doing bad things. You want them punished. You fear them hurting the Atreides, and you come to you're stressed out when they're on screen or in the book, and you feel the risk. So make the story make us care more about the story and the people. Spend more time on a smaller scope so that we get attached to them. Reward players for figuring things out. Try to find places where people being smart tells them where not to waste their time. Give people clues about what cards are least likely to have information that they need and most likely. Let players feel smart about figuring that out. Get rid of this consequence token draw. Figure out a better, more logical way to do that. Add more moral weight and psychological weight to the decisions. Completely revisit this end chapter status report questions. That has to be much more interesting, much more consequential. Ask the people a couple of questions and give them a satisfying end animation based on what they choose to do, so that they feel like they're getting something based on their answer. Here's some advice from Jonathan. Twists really need to be more focused in the middle of the story. I think that's true. Like, it needed a twist. It needed a couple moments where like, whoa. When we played detective, not Jonathan and I, when Greg and I played detective, there were moments in Detective where we were like, whoa, that's why that happened. Or whoa, that's the connection. Or that's the twist. And one, riffing off what Jonathan said about twists, like one of the most satisfying parts of Chronicles of Crime and any of these games that are continuing campaigns is when you make a campaign, you've got a gift. And the gift is that time is passing, right? That they play one game, another game, and things can happen that have consequences. So you can make an event happen in chapter 2 that emotionally involves the players or represents a little twist in the story, and you're like, whoa, that changes everything. That means I have to reevaluate what I thought. And like, this game didn't have that. And that's a real missed opportunity. Like, yeah, chapter 2 could have had a twist that could make an enemy out of someone we thought was our friend and make us really feel like, now we're going to go get them. And a twist. Yeah, a twist would have been, a really compelling twist would have been nice. And a gradually unfolding mystery. What was the gradually unfolding mystery here? It wasn't anything important. From prologue to chapter 3 end, it was all about the same thing. Find that one guy who crashed. We were sort of interested in finding out his identity and why people wanted him, but that was all inconsequential. It didn't matter for us really. For us really, the only thing we did from start to end was try to locate this person that we never got to meet, that we never located. Here's another piece of advice from Jonathan. It says, if the story is going to be less personal, it needs more setup. For the factions need to have some idea of where they are trying to get to, what are their plans, then can subvert it or not. Yeah, I think that's true and more. The fact that the key players in this game were these two cartels that we had very little involvement on. And the little involvement, the little attempt to backstory them was just lost in this flood of information. Like, one was married, was going to get married to Junis, the other Sarko family, the Quinat and the Demasu, and like, we were given some backstory to these people, but we're not connected to them. Even if you know the lore, you're not connected to these people, and it was just not enough, and there was just too random and too much of a wall of text of these different backstories that we could not get involved in these cartels. And yeah, if you want to make a story that's heavily dependent on these three factions, you have to give us a way to care a little bit about the factions. Like if you watch Fistful of Dollars, you got to introduce us to these two factions and make us care and really know the personalities of these people. It's weird that the sort of heads of these two cartels were off screen and we never really got much of feeling for them, of their personalities and their motives, and cared about them. Yeah, and maybe like if they were vying for our interest and both cartels were trying to get us on our side, the game basically said, here's the cartel you like, here's this other cartel. You really don't have much of a feel for them. They don't do anything personal to you. They're both hunting for the same guy. They're both acting, you have no reason to favor one or the other, really. And they seem sort of anonymous, identical cartels. More work had to be done to bring us into this world of these characters. Jonathan says, make us more directly involved. It's an adventure. Yeah, it's true. It was very weird that we were sort of periphery to everything that was happening. And not just, we weren't just periphery, but like our whole intro is, we're this person that was rescued by this Zarzur, this inconsequential Fremen rebel, rescued us, and we owe a debt, so she's put us to task to do these little chores for her. We weren't directly involved. We didn't know anyone. We were bit players, and we didn't even know why we should care about helping her. And in fact, we're helping her, but the game was like, at the finale, it was like, boy, it's a good thing you didn't let this person come into the hands of the Fremen. It was just weird. Like, we didn't end up helping the one person we could have helped, and we didn't really care about Zarzur or any of the Fremen. Too similar. I think that's a more general piece of advice. If you're making an adventure game, a mystery game, anything like this, that the players, when you're making a game, instead of making a 500-page novel or whatever, you have to choose your battles in terms of giving characters personality and scope. And sometimes that means exaggerating personality so they're differentiable. And that was not done. Like, all of the characters in this, whether it was this guy who worked in this office or the barkeep, like, they were all just bit players without any interesting part or personality or character to latch onto. So it's very hard to keep these people as little flavored characters that were in our mind. More work needed to be made to make them differentiating characters. Like, if you do Sherlock Holmes and you go to visit the different people, they have very different personalities. They talk in a very caricatured manner. They act differently. There's a real attempt to make people have definitive, interesting character traits and the ways they interact. They feel different. The different people feel different. And that was missed here. Everyone felt samey and boring and flat, including us, and including the main people we were trying to rescue, and included the main bad guy, which is inexplicable that even the main Scorpion had like no personality and no emotional investment built up in him. Like, we didn't watch him do horrendous things that would make us care. I would love to hear, I'd love to watch and hear a group that loves the game and their take on it. It's certainly possible. It's very easy to have different takes on these games, but especially if it's a group that has also played Detective and Vienna Connection. I am really curious to hear if there are people who played those games who liked Dune. Jonathan makes another fantastic point. He says, here's some advice. If you're going to make us investigate a crime, make us investigate the crime. Some guy, when we played, just admits to killing Adam. This is such a good point. This whole 3-chapter arc is like, find this mystery person. And we spent the first chapter or two like trying to find his identity and where they might be hiding. And it's built up as this is going to be super important, how you find his identity. How do we find he's connected to the other guy? Like, we're tracking this down as if it's a mystery, right? And this built up, like the one part of this game that's built up is like, here's this mystery you can try to figure out. And then we go into this bar, the brothel, and we overhear some guy talk about how he's the guy who killed him. Like, we're trying to figure out, how was Adam Sorko killed? That was the other part of the mystery. Like, how was Adam Sorko killed? Why? What was it in connection to? It felt like this was this real part of this mystery we were trying to solve. How was Adam Sorko killed? Why? All that. We overhear this guy saying, oh yeah, I killed him in this bar fight. And when that happened, we're like, he's claiming he killed him. He probably didn't kill him. Like, that's just to throw us off the scent. Because obviously they're not going to wrap up this key mystery just by hearing us randomly run into some guy at a tavern that admits to it. But then as we went on, we were like, no, that was it. That guy is just a bit soldier, a bit player, not an important person, doesn't even have a name. And we just overheard this bit soldier happen to kill and solve one of our main mysteries that we randomly got by walking into a bar and hearing it. That's bizarre. you can't make players think that they're detectives solving a crime and then have the answers given to them by overhearing a random conversation. That's again gets back to trust, because when we heard that, my reaction was like, that's probably false. Like, logically, it's just a guy bragging that he killed this important person to get further bragging points to his fellow soldiers. Like, that's meant to throw us off our trail. Like, that's a cool little side element to throw us off our trail. And we're going to be smart by realizing that it's just someone bragging to be a tough guy. But turned out that was it. It was that surface level. It might have been nice if we had been able to say, like, do we have time to try to solve this side mystery? And if we were agonizing between, should we waste time should we try to lock down our primary goal, or should we risk following this lead that we know is going to help us with our secondary goal? That's another way you could sort of make these decisions a little more psychological and agonizing. If you sort of gave people at the beginning, like, here are these 3 things you could figure out, and then you made players figure out, well, we have to cut our loss. We are going to have to give up on solving that 3rd one because we really want to make sure we understand this first one. And that could be an interesting decision if we had to decide between, do you try to learn a lot of these, a little about everything, or a lot about one thing? But in this game, we were just sort of randomly flailing around. We never knew what was going to give us what information. Subjective advice, bring in the zone system from Vienna is more fun than the time tracker. That is a very interesting point you brought up. It's interesting. You're bringing up things I haven't thought of. Yes, in Detective, they have a system of moving around to different zones, and there's a gamey element there of it takes time to travel, and so you're focused on how to efficiently do some clues at the same location before you leave. I don't think that was very successful. I think it was again a gamey element like the tokens that was almost unpredictable for the players. So it felt like you were adding a gamey element that depended on predicting the outcome of a coin toss. And I think in general that was a bad idea. Now, the zones in Vienna Connection were much more interesting. There, they felt like that seemed like a much cleverer system, a little bit sneaking behind the curtains to peek at the mechanics. To me, that felt less like a gamey mechanic in terms of decisions the player made, but more like a way of the game corralling you into saying, we want you to find 3 clues from this set, and we also want you, before you try to solve it, to find 2 clues from this set. And it's a way of making you not go too deep down a rabbit hole, which is exactly the kind of thing that this game should be leaning into, looking for mechanics that help you control where the players go to help you ensure that players get enough information to solve it. So, I mean, I agree with you, maybe not for the same exact reasons, but I think the zone idea was much more clever. And that was a perfect example where they had a way of saying, well, look, if you really want to go down this rabbit hole, if you really want to go down this avenue, we're going to give you a way to do that. It's going to cost you something. It's going to cost you a little bit of time. But we will let you look more in this area if you're personally invested. But it was a way of sort of hinting that you should go in certain areas. But it also, I think, as Jonathan was saying, it was enjoyable. It was sort of felt like it gave you, here's another thing. We talk about sort of the predictability versus randomness. It gave you a way of saying, well, if I go here in this zone, I have some idea, a little narrowing idea of what kinds of information I'll get. And that's what you want in a game like this. You want players to be able to reason a little bit about what kind of information they're going to get. And the zones did that, whereas this didn't. This time track thing, paying for cards, just felt like a way to force you to have to make random decisions about where to go. And the whole consequence track thing is inexplicable what that gains you. Or if you're trying to add a little excitement about, doing the slot machine randomly drawing from here, it wasn't the case, because we just determined very early that this was most of the time going to lead to a failure. So the only thing we did was we said, well, is it worth losing an experience point to see another card? But not knowing how important the experience was, now we see it wasn't useful at all. You'd be stupid not to draw from that every chance you got. But that's essentially the conclusion we came to as we played. Like once we got past the first time we skipped it, reading a card is so valuable, since your time is so short, that we always chose, other than the first time, which we didn't do because the game gave us no hint as to how often we were going to encounter these opportunities. And because you encountered them so rarely, the right answer is always draw from that card, always assume it's going to be a red, and always let it move down. There's no real cost to it. We never got close to hitting 0. It was only by hiding how often we were going to have to draw from that bag that the game ever got us to initially not draw from the bag. If the premise is we're not going to ask you to solve mysteries with the questions, right? Like a traditional detective game, you're asked, who's the murderer? Where did they kill him? And then you can answer, and then the game will tell you if you get it right or wrong. And the idea to move away from that, I thought was going to be to move into questions that are either rewarding for story purposes, like you say, do you want to arrest this person or arrest this person? Do you want to do this or this? And then the game's story will tell you, well, we arrested this person, and then this interesting thing happened, and you tied up that loose end. But there's no right or wrong answer. If you had chosen B, you would have gotten a different wrap-up. But we had several times in this game where the question seemed to be almost asking us like an honor system question. Like the question was like, did you figure out the right place to go? It didn't. It could let you give an answer and tell you whether you're right or wrong. But it also wasn't like you choose something and we're going to give you a different story based on it. It's basically saying, like, imagine a detective game, at the end it said, did you find the correct murderer? And you say yes or no. And if you say yes, it says, yes, you're right. It was Professor Colonel. It was Professor Mustard in the drawing room. And you're like, what if I'm wrong, but told you that I found the right answer? Some of those questions were weird in that respect. They looked like they were asking you to answer an honor question about whether you, like, imagine that last case. The last case we got asked, do you know where they're planning to escape? Right? Imagine we had not opened a single card in that chapter. Right? And we just clicked, go to the end. And then the person asks us, do you know where they're going to escape? And we say yes. And then the game tells us, you were right. They were going to the helicopter, and we found them there and killed them. Like, who said I decided that was where they went? Weird. Jonathan Scarface says, let it be stated on a card that you achieved a second objective. Then at the end, just ask the team if they did it. Yeah, maybe if you don't want to ask the person the answer, have a card tell you when you found the right answer. Like, have a card be the card you would turn over if you choose this person, and then have the card say, okay. I thought that was what was going to happen with the victory points. I assumed that at the end it was going to ask us how many victory points. And there was another card we got in chapter 2 where it said, you gain access to the medicine or whatever. And I was like, oh, maybe at the end we're going to be asked if we got access to the medicine. But it didn't. It just said, you've decided to poison the medicine. Do you want to spend your 2 tokens to do it? There was an interesting thing, like if we didn't have the tokens, I guess it would have told us you tried, but you failed. But yeah, I guess throughout the game there was this feeling of, is the game going to congratulate us for doing something? Is the game going to confirm that we did something right? And it rarely did, and occasionally it asked us to just give our opinion. Hey, do you think you did well on that test? You did? Great. The kid goes to the teacher. How did I do on the test? Well, how do you think you did on the test? I think I got an A. Okay, good work. That's a little weird. Jonathan says, get subtitles on those videos. I think you could go further. Like, they must have had plans to make more videos and just never got around to it. It was very weird that 90% of the videos were just pure text. They didn't need to be a video. Like, we put in the film strip, right? And we got a little animation of the projector turning on and then just text. Put that on a sheet. That should have been a sheet like in Vienna Connection to read the transcripts. And the videos didn't need to be used for anything except where there was animation. And you could have had more background, gentle introduction to the lore of Dune, and maybe used as an opportunity to care about the characters. Like, if you want us to care about Junis or the different cartels, you could have given us some nice animated introductions to them that fleshed them out, that gave them some personality. That's an opportunity to do things that text can't, like give us some emotional connection to some of these characters or background story. If we're supposed to care about these characters, these named characters, give us some video with those characters in it. Then we can hear that their accent's different, they look different, we can associate a face, an attitude towards a person. Maybe we'll develop some sympathy for them. Like, give us some connection to these characters.